Man, you really can't ignore all the rising tension coming out of the Middle East these days.
Hmm.
Like President Trump, his recent warning to Iran about those Houthi attacks in Yemen. It's put this conflict that's been simmering for years right back in the spotlight, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. And it's complicated, right?
Oh, incredibly so.
And that's exactly why we're here to kind of unpack it all for you.
Exactly. To go deep.
Yeah, we've gone through a ton of material to pull out, the key pieces.
Yeah.
Like, what's the history behind all this? What's driving the main players, the US, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all of them, and, what might happen next. We don't want to overload you with information, but
Right.
we want to give you a clear, solid grasp of this whole tangled situation.
Yeah, because where do you even begin with something like this? There are so many layers to peel back.
Well, I think a smart place to start is to understand that this situation in Yemen, it's not some isolated thing. It's really deeply tied to this much wider, longer-running rivalry between, Iran and Saudi Arabia fighting for influence in the region.
Right.
So you can almost think of Yemen as like, well, it's one of the more active battlegrounds, you could say, in this whole ongoing power struggle.
Right. Okay, so it's not just about Yemen itself. It's part of this much bigger game, this chess match between these powers.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you have the Houthi movement. They're at the heart of what's happening on the ground there in Yemen, right?
Absolutely. They're a Zaidi Shia minority group in Yemen. And get this, their resistance against the Yemeni government, which, by the way, has often been backed by Saudi Arabia. It actually goes back way before this current conflict, back to the early 2000s.
Wow, okay.
So they had their own local issues, ambitions, and then it all got kind of, well, amplified, mixed up in these bigger regional power struggles.
Gotcha. So you have these local tensions that then get swept up into these global and regional ambitions,
Precisely.
which honestly is a pattern that we see over and over again in history, isn't it?
Right.
And then, of course, you have the Arab Spring in 2011, which it sounds like was a real turning point for Yemen.
Oh, completely. Those uprisings across the region, they created these huge power vacuums, so much instability. And in Yemen, well, this really gave the Houthis a chance to, really increase their influence. By 2014, they'd actually taken control of the capital, Sarna.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was a major, major shift in the balance of power.
Okay, so that's the point where Saudi Arabia felt like they had to step in directly, militarily, right?
Exactly. They saw this Houthi takeover as a direct threat, like Iran was basically setting up shop right on their border.
Right on their doorstep.
So in 2015, they launched this military intervention, with a coalition of other Gulf states. And it's important to note, this whole move had at least tacit backing from the U.S. at the time.
Interesting.
Their initial goal was to put the previous government back in power.
But obviously things haven't really gone according to that plan, have they? I mean, we keep hearing about the Houthis not just holding their own, but actually launching these increasingly sophisticated attacks.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. You have this Saudi-led coalition with all this military might, but the Houthis have been unbelievably resilient. They're using increasingly advanced weapons now, missiles, drones, and the general consensus is that a lot of this tech is coming from Iran,
Wow.
which just underscores how complex this all is. This
Yeah.
isn't just some simple internal conflict. There's so much more going on.
Right. And this brings us to the role of the U.S., because we often hear about them supporting Saudi Arabia in all this, with weapons, intelligence, logistics, the whole nine yards. So it's safe to say the U.S. has been pretty firmly in the Saudi corner throughout all this, right?
Absolutely. And to understand why, we have to look at what the U.S. is really trying to achieve in the region. Like, what are their main interests that this conflict touches on?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones that always comes up is oil. Making sure that the oil keeps flowing, that global markets stay stable. The Middle East is still absolutely crucial to global energy, and any disruption there could have huge immediate economic consequences all over the world, including, of course, back home in the U.S.
Right. Even with the U.S. producing more of its own energy these days.
Exactly.
That kind of global economic stability, that's a primary concern.
For sure. And then there's the whole issue of arms sales. I mean, it might be a bit of a harsh reality, but all this tension and conflict in the Middle East, it creates this big demand for American-made weapons.
It does.
And, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're major buyers. So these sales, they bring in huge amounts of money for the U.S. military-industrial complex. They support jobs, innovation, that whole sector of the economy.
Oh, it's a powerful economic engine, no doubt. And the continuation of these regional conflicts, it does, unfortunately, keep that engine running.
Right.
Now, the third major U.S. interest that often gets mentioned is this idea of countering Iran's influence.
Exactly. The U.S. sees Iran's growing influence, not just in Yemen, but also in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, as a direct challenge to its own interests and those of its allies in the region.
Mm.
And so supporting Saudi Arabia is seen as a way to push back against that, against what they see as Iranian expansionism.
Okay, so that's the U.S. perspective. Safeguarding global economic stability, reaping the economic benefits of these arms exports, and the strategic imperative to contain a rival. Now, let's shift gears and look at things from Tehran's side. What's Iran hoping to achieve in Yemen? What are their goals?
Well, it seems like Iran has a pretty multi-layered strategy here. One part of it is this idea of keeping Saudi Arabia tied up in this really expensive conflict. The Yemen campaign has been draining Saudi resources for years now, and there's no easy end in sight. So from Iran's perspective, the longer this drags on, the more it weakens Saudi Arabia, the more it strains their resources.
So it's like a form of asymmetric warfare, right?
Exactly.
Where they're using their support for the Houthis to really put a financial strain on a much richer adversary.
Right, a way to punch above their weight,
Mm.
in a way. And then the second part of Iran's approach is about projecting power, projecting influence throughout the region.
Okay, I see.
By backing groups like the Houthis, Hezbollah in Lebanon, various Shia militias in Iraq, they're building this network of allies all across the Middle East. And this lets them exert pressure, have a say in regional affairs without having to get directly involved in these big conventional wars themselves.
So they're building a sphere of influence, but through these, well, these proxy relationships. Very clever.
Exactly. And the third element of their strategy has to do with the sanctions, the international sanctions that have been hitting the Iranian economy really hard.
Right, especially those imposed by the U.S.
Exactly. And by stirring up instability in the region, Iran might be trying to pressure the U.S. to reconsider those sanctions, maybe even bring them to the negotiating table.
So Iran's playing a long game here, weaken a regional rival, expand their influence, and maybe find a way out from under those sanctions.
It's all connected. Now, switching to Saudi Arabia's perspective,
Yeah.
I mean, they went into this intervention thinking it would be a quick, decisive win.
Yeah, that was the initial thought.
But the reality on the ground now, well, it's a different story.
It's definitely not what they envisioned.
Not at all. Despite all the airstrikes, the blockades, everything they've thrown at them, the Houthis are still a potent force. And all this has led to a lot of international criticism of Saudi Arabia because of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen.
Right, the scale of suffering there has been immense. It's truly tragic.
Absolutely. And even within Saudi Arabia, there's apparently growing unease, even discontent about the financial burden of this war. I mean, it's been going on for years, no clear end in sight, and the Houthis are still a threat. So people are starting to ask some tough questions about whether this whole intervention was a good idea.
Okay.
And all this puts Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in a really tough spot, right?
Yeah.
He needs to project strength in the region, but he's also facing the economic realities and the domestic pressure of this increasingly costly stalemate.
So it's a tricky balancing act for him. Big regional ambitions, but with these real economic limits and a lot of scrutiny from the outside. And all this makes you wonder about the financial side of things. Who's winning, who's losing in all this?
Well, like we said earlier, the U.S. defense industry is definitely coming out ahead. The constant demand for weapons from Saudi Arabia and its allies means big profits for companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, all the big players.
So there's a clear economic upside for that sector of the U.S. economy, even while the bigger strategic picture is still debated. Now, this might surprise some people, but who else seems to be winning, at least financially, from all this?
It's interesting. The analysis suggests that Iran, even with all the sanctions they're facing, can actually be seen as a winner here. Think about it. They've managed to support the Houthis just enough to keep this conflict going for years, forcing Saudi Arabia to spend way, way more than they have. It's a classic case of asymmetric warfare, really effective, low cost, high impact, all about draining their rivals' resources.
It shows how even when you're up against a much richer opponent, you can still use these kinds of strategies to your advantage.
For sure. And then, of course, you have the Houthis themselves. They've not only survived all this military pressure, they've actually expanded their control and shown they can really project power with those missile and drone attacks. So in a sense, this whole conflict has actually strengthened their position in northern Yemen.
Wow, okay. So we have the U.S. defense industry, Iran playing their cards very carefully, and the Houthis actually gaining strength from all this. Now, flipping that around, who are the economic losers here?
Well, there's no question that Saudi Arabia has taken a big hit financially. All that spending on this military intervention and no real victory to show for it, it's a massive drain on their resources, money that could have been used for other things.
It's been a costly endeavor, to say the least. And who's bearing the brunt of the economic fallout? Tragically.
It's the Yemeni people, no question.
Mm.
The conflict has absolutely devastated their infrastructure, destroyed livelihoods, caused widespread poverty, food shortages, the whole 9 yards. It's a heartbreaking humanitarian crisis, and the economic consequences for ordinary Yemenis have been devastating.
It's a stark reminder of the true cost of conflict. The human cost goes way beyond just the casualties on the battlefield. Now, are there wider economic ripples, effects that go beyond the region itself?
Oh, absolutely. You have to remember, the whole global economy is potentially at risk here. Any serious escalation in the Middle East could disrupt global oil supplies, and that could send oil prices skyrocketing, which of course would lead to inflation all over the world, hitting economies and everyday people everywhere.
So what starts as a regional conflict can have these huge global economic consequences.
Exactly, it's all connected. Now, looking ahead, the analysis we have lays out 3 possible scenarios for the future.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first one?
Well, the first scenario is, the optimistic one. It's the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough. And the recent peace talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the ones that China helped facilitate, those are seen as a hopeful sign, a potential first step towards de-escalation, maybe even a broader peace that includes Yemen.
Those talks were definitely a big deal. It suggests that maybe things are starting to shift in the region.
Yeah, maybe. But even if everyone wants peace, there are still some big obstacles to actually making it happen, especially in Yemen.
Like what? What are the main roadblocks?
Well, a major one seems to be that Saudi Arabia isn't really willing to officially recognize the Houthis as a legitimate political force.
Ah, I see.
And for any kind of lasting peace to happen, there has to be some kind of political deal that includes them. They can't just be ignored.
They're a major player now.
Exactly. But the analysis suggests that with enough pressure from the international community, especially from countries like China and Russia, who have their own reasons for wanting stability in the region, well, maybe that could push things forward, create the right conditions for a deal.
Okay, so a diplomatic solution, it makes the most sense, but there are definitely some big political hurdles to overcome. What's the second scenario?
The second one's a bit more concerning. It's the possibility of the U.S. getting more directly involved militarily. And President Trump's recent warning, his tough stance on Iran and those Houthi attacks, that's definitely raised the possibility that the U.S. might take a more active role.
Yeah, that statement was pretty strong. It definitely suggests a potential shift in U.S. policy.
Right. So what could that escalation actually look like?
What are the possibilities?
Well, it could mean more military aid for Saudi Arabia, maybe even giving them more advanced weapons or sharing more intelligence. It could also mean direct U.S. airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, or even ramping up the sanctions against Iran.
And what are the risks there? What could go wrong with that approach?
Well, in the short term, sure, it might weaken the Houthis.
Yeah.
But the real danger is that it'll provoke a much stronger response from Iran. And that could mean retaliation, and then you have the potential for this conflict to spread even further across the region.
Right, it's that classic problem with military interventions. You can't always predict what the consequences will be. It's a risky path.
Absolutely. Now, the third scenario that the analysis outlines is, well, it's the one where Saudi Arabia decides to cut its losses. They basically realize that this war is too expensive, too politically damaging, and they decide to pull out. Now, this is presented as a longer-term possibility, not something that's going to happen overnight. But,
Right. But how would that actually play out? What would a withdrawal look like?
well, it could take a few different forms. Maybe they directly negotiate with the Houthis, try to reach some kind of power-sharing agreement. Or maybe it's a more gradual withdrawal of their troops while they try to build up other Yemeni forces that are friendly to their interests. Either way, it would be a major change in Saudi Arabia's strategy, a recognition that their initial goals just haven't been achievable.
So they'd be scaling back their ambitions, adjusting to the realities on the ground. It makes sense given all the pressure they're facing. So as we wrap this up, what are your main takeaways from this whole situation, all the complexity of what's happening in Yemen?
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway is that this conflict is so much bigger than just Yemen itself. It's deeply entangled with this much broader power struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the U.S. is a major player in all this, driven by its own interests, both strategic and economic. And the Houthis, well, they've proven to be much more resilient than anyone expected. And the human cost, the financial cost of this war, It's just been staggering.
And then you have President Trump's recent statements, right? They're a clear sign that things could escalate even further. But the thing is, if you look at the history of this conflict, it doesn't seem likely that any side is going to achieve a decisive military victory anytime soon. Diplomatic solutions, those the best hope, but there are huge political obstacles in the way. And whether Saudi Arabia can afford to keep this military campaign going much longer, well, that's a big question mark, given all the costs involved.
Absolutely. And this leads to a final thought we want to leave you with. I mean, the global economy, it's all interconnected, and the Middle East has this long, often very volatile history. So with all that in mind, what could happen if this conflict keeps escalating? Or even if there's a sudden, unexpected change in alliances? It really makes you think beyond just the headlines and consider the ripple effects, all the potential consequences, both intended and unintended. And on that note,
Yeah,
that's our deep dive for today.
thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.